Today I'm going to tell you a story about a woman who was meant to die in the desert in 1882. But instead of a bullet, she received a promise. A wild, defiant phrase, "If you're going to kill me, kiss me first." From that moment, the fate of both the hunter and the hunted was forever changed. This is not only a tale of love, but of buried truth's betrayal and the fight of a woman to reclaim her voice in a town that wanted her forgotten. So pull up a chair, pour yourself a cup of coffee, and together, let's ride into the Wild West, where even from ashes love can bloom. The year was 1882, and the desert lay like a giant skeleton under the noon sun, white bones of salt and dust, ribs of broken mesquite, a horizon that seemed to burn rather than breathe. Isabella Marlowe sat on the hard plank of a wagon seat, wrists bound the rope biting into her skin. She had not asked where they were taking her. She knew only that the men who carried rifles at her back would not deliver her to any courthouse. Somewhere between one dune and the next, she realized this was not a trial, it was an erasure. The wagon lurched to a stop. One of the guards muttered something about changing horses, then spat in the dust. Isabella lifted her chin. At 38, she had long learned that silence was sometimes the only weapon a woman could wield. Yet in her silence, she listened the creak of leather, the shifting of boots, and then a second set of footsteps, heavier, deliberate, almost lazy. He came into view like a shadow cut from the sun. Tall, broad, with the weary confidence of a man who had lived by the gun too long. His shirt hung open at the collar, sweat and dust tracing his chest, and his eyes, gray, watchful, studied her, as if weighing the price of her soul. "Jack Callahan," one of the guards said, almost with relief. "Man who'll finish what we started." So this was it. No courthouse, no last confession, just a hired bullet. Isabella's heart pounded against her ribs, but outwardly she held still, as if refusing to give the desert the satisfaction of her fear. Jack walked closer, the revolver at his side gleaming dully. He was no sheriff, no deputy. She had seen enough men like him during the war, men who carried death as casually as others carried bread. His gaze held hers for a long time, and in that gaze Isabella sensed something she could not name. Hesitation, perhaps, or curiosity, like a wolf circling prey it wasn't quite ready to devour. Her lips trembled and then steadied. If words could not save her life, perhaps they could save her dignity. "If you're going to kill me," she said, her voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut the still air, "kiss me first." The guards laughed, coarse and startled, as if the condemned had lost her senses. But Jack did not laugh. His eyes narrowed, and for the briefest flicker of a moment, something unreadable, regret, surprise, maybe recognition, passed across his face. The desert held its breath. Isabella felt the weight of her words echo inside her chest. She had meant them as defiance, a last act of rebellion against the faceless cruelty that had stripped her name from the town, her place from the world. Yet now under his gaze the words rang with something more dangerous, longing. Jack's revolver remained in his hand, but he did not raise it. Instead, he stepped closer, the leather of his boots whispering over sand. He reached for the rope at her wrists, tightening it, not loosening. "No kiss," he murmured, his voice gravel low, almost reluctant. "Not today." And still he did not fire. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected a clean end, not this pause, not this man, measuring something invisible in the silence between them. From Isabella's bound hands, the blood drained until her fingers numbed. From her chest breath came shallow, but her eyes did not drop. For reasons she did not yet understand, she felt the fire of survival flare brighter, as if this stranger's hesitation had given her a sliver of ground to stand upon. Jack looked at her one last time, long and steady, then jerked his head toward the wagon. "We deliver her. Alive, alive." The word struck Isabella harder than the threat of the gun. Alive meant more questions. Alive meant she was still a piece on the board, though she could not yet see the game. As the wagon creaked forward again, the desert swallowed their tracks. And in Isabella's chest beneath the fear, something smoldered an ember neither rope nor bullet had yet managed to kill. Don't look away just yet. What you've seen is only the beginning. If you want to ride with me deeper into the Wild West, where every glance could cost a life, hit subscribe. There are secrets waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss them. Jack did not kiss her. He did not pull the trigger either. The moment hung between them, thin as a thread shimmering in the desert light. He broke it, not with a bullet, but with the rasp of rope tightening around her wrists. The guards smirked, muttering about a woman's madness, but Jack's face remained unreadable, carved from dust and silence. The knot bit into her skin. Isabella flinched, but she kept her eyes steady on him. She wanted to see the face of the man who would end her life. Yet what she saw unsettled her, more than the gleam of his revolver hesitation, like a shadow of memory flickering across his eyes. Jack finished binding her and stepped back, his jaw working as though chewing on something bitter. To the guards, it looked like indifference. But inside Jack Callahan's mind, something had cracked open. He knew that face. Not from town gossip, not from the hushed stories about a mayor's discarded wife. From another time, mud and blood, not dust and sun. A field hospital during the war, the stink of gunpowder and dying boys. His mother, lying pale on a cot, fever burning through her chest. And a nurse, hair tucked beneath a kerchief, hands steady, though the world collapsed around her. A voice soft as ether, "You'll live, I promise you'll live." Jack swallowed hard. The memory surged clear and merciless. It was her, Isabella Marlowe. The woman tied before him now had once bent over his mother with needle and bandage, pulling her back from death, when the world would have thrown her away. But her eyes held no recognition. Why should they? To her, he had only been a boy kneeling by a cot, begging a nameless nurse to save his only family. To him, it had been salvation. To her, only another wound among hundreds. Jack's grip tightened on the rope. A man like him did not believe in providence. Coincidence, perhaps. Contracts, certainly. But fate was a word he had spat out years ago. And yet, what were the odds? The guards barked at him to finish the job, but his revolver stayed holstered. His stomach twisted. If Isabella Marlowe was the woman who had saved his mother, then the contract smelled different. Not justice, not law. Something rotten. He studied her again. A condemned woman who did not beg. A nurse who once chose to save strangers, now sentenced to vanish without trial. Why? Jack felt the desert close in the sun pressing down, as if demanding an answer he did not yet have. His life had always been simple, a target, a bullet, a payment. But this was tangled with blood and memory. He jerked his head toward the wagon. "She rides alive," he said, voice low, leaving no room for argument. The guards shifted uneasily, but obeyed. As they hauled Isabella back onto the wooden bench, Jack walked behind and resting on the revolver at his hip, but mind far from the weapon. For the first time in years, he questioned the hand that fed him silver. And in that question lay the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. The desert knew everything. It remembered wagon tracks long after the wheels had broken bones, long after the flesh had dried, whispers long after the mouths that spoke them had turned to dust. And now it carried two travelers who were not companions, yet bound more tightly than most lovers, a prisoner and her escort, each uncertain which of them bore the heavier chain. Isabella rode on the wooden bench, wrists tied the coarse hemp, rasping her skin each time the wagon lurched. Ahead of her, the horizon wavered like molten glass. She forced herself not to look back at the man, walking beside the wheel, his revolver holstered, but his presence a weight heavier than the heat. He had not killed her. That alone puzzled her more than the ropes. He was a hired gun. His work was death. Yet he had chosen restraint, as though the desert itself had stayed his hand. Hours passed in silence, save for the creak of the axle and the cry of a distant hawk. Isabella felt her lips crack from thirst, but she would not beg, not for water, not for mercy. She had begged once in her life, and it had bought her nothing but a marriage that turned to prison walls. Jack studied her when he thought she wasn't looking. Most condemned souls pleaded, cursed, or bartered, but not this one. She held herself upright, chin lifted against the burning wind, as if the desert had no right to see her broken. He had seen her before, though she did not know it. The memory of the field hospital gnawed at him like a half-healed wound. Her hands pressing cloth against his mother's chest, the voice steady, promising life where death crouched at the door. Jack had carried that voice for decades, though he had never known the name behind it. Now she sat tied before him, condemned to vanish, like so many others. And he was the one hired to erase her. As dusk bled across the sand, the wagon halted at a dry arroyo. Jack tossed a canteen toward her. The rope at her wrists made it awkward, but she managed to drink water spilling down her chin. For a moment, she caught his eyes. "You don't ask," he said quietly, as if speaking to himself. "For what?" Her voice was hoarse but firm. "For your life." Isabella's mouth curved not in a smile, but something galled her. "A woman like me has lived too long on borrowed time. Begging won't change the debt." Jack turned away, jaw tight. Her words lodged under his skin like splinters. Later, by the campfire shadows long across the sand, Isabella spoke again, her tone not confessional, but matter-of-fact, like stitching a wound. "I was Holden Marlowe's wife, mayor of Prosperity. You must have heard of him." Jack grunted, eyes on the fire. Of course he had heard, a man of influence, a voice that carried weight in every saloon. "I was also a nurse. War years. Before Holden." She paused, gaze drifting past the flames into the dark, as if seeing ghosts there. "Men don't remember the hands that keep them alive. They remember the ones that kill them. Still, I sewed flesh-cooled fevers. 100 boys, maybe more." Jack's hand stilled on the revolver he had been cleaning. The words struck him like a blow. She did not remember. She had saved his mother, as she had saved countless others. Another nameless mercy in a world that swallowed names whole. He wanted to tell her, to speak the memory aloud, to say, "I was there. I owe you more than silver or blood." But the words stayed locked in his chest, heavy as stones. Instead, he muttered, "Desert doesn't care about saints or killers. Swallows them the same." Isabella's eyes caught the firelight, unflinching. The desert may not care, but people should. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of two lives, circling an unspoken truth of debts remembered on one side and forgotten on the other, of a gunman who had lost faith and a woman who refused to surrender it. The desert knew, and it waited. Night fell like a blade across the desert. The fire was little more than a circle of embers, its glow barely holding back the vast blackness, pressing in from every side. Jack sat with his back against a boulder, revolver loose in his hand, while Isabella lay, tethered a few feet away, her figure folded into shadows. The silence of night in the desert was never true silence. Coyotes yipped far off, an owl called from some hollow mesquite, and the wind dragged thin threads of sand across stone. But there was another sound so faint, it might have been a trick of nerves that set Jack's instincts on edge. A boot scuffed. Too close. He rose in one swift motion. "Stay down," he muttered toward Isabella, though she had not moved. Then the darkness split. A man surged forward, knife gleaming in the firelight. His strike was aimed not at Jack, but at Isabella, the bound silhouette by the stones. The revolver fired before Isabella had even drawn breath. The shot cracked the night wide open, echoing across empty canyons. The attacker stumbled, steel flashing once, before he crumpled into the sand. But not before his blade grazed Jack's side. The second shot came late, Jack's hand shaking with pain, and missed. By then the stranger was already choking on dust, the knife slipping from his fingers. Toilance rushed back in, heavier than before. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She had not screamed. The war had taught her how useless screams were. But her eyes widened as Jack staggered, one hand pressed to his flank, where blood seeped dark against his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, the words cutting through the still air. Jack's reply was a grimace. He dropped to one knee, breath harsh. Isabella pulled against the ropes at her wrists. "Untie me." He hesitated, suspicion flickering through the haze of pain. But another wave of blood soaked through his fingers, hot and wet, and his knees buckled. Cursing under his breath, he sliced the rope with his own knife and collapsed back against the boulder. Isabella was at his side in an instant. Her hands, freed at last, did not reach for a weapon or for escape. Instead, they pressed against his wound, quick and sure, as though no years had passed since the field hospitals of the war. Jack blinked at her through the haze, confusion mingling with agony. This woman, his prisoner, his target, could have run. She could have left him to bleed beneath the indifferent stars. Instead, she worked with fierce precision, tearing fabric from her own dress to staunch the flow. "Hold still," she commanded, the tone of a nurse who would not be argued with. Jack gritted his teeth. "Why?" Her eyes flashed toward him, fierce in the firelight. "Because you're alive, and as long as I can stop the bleeding, you'll stay that way." The absurdity of it struck him even as the world tilted. She was saving the life of the very man paid to end hers. A bitter laugh caught in his throat, but turned to a cough. He shut his eyes, surrendering to her touch, because the alternative was death. Minutes stretched, measured in shallow breaths, and the press of cloth against blood. At last the flow slowed. Isabella leaned back, arms trembling, but steady, her face pale. "You'll live," she murmured, not to comfort him, but as a clinical truth. The words echoed the memory he carried from childhood, the same voice that had once promised his mother's survival. It rattled him more than the wound. Through the fog of pain, Jack understood something else. This was no simple contract. Someone had hired more than one gun. Holden, or whoever else was behind this, was not merely silencing a troublesome wife. They feared her, feared something she carried. Evidence, seethy secrets, a truth sharp enough to make powerful men tremble. Jack let his head fall back against the rock, breath shallow, but steady. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the dark. Isabella's hands were red with his blood. She wiped them on the sand, then looked at him, at the man who held her fate, and now owed her his life. Neither spoke. The desert did not need words. It already knew that something had shifted in the balance of power, in the tangle of debt, in the mystery of why Isabella Marlowe must die. Jack closed his eyes, a grim realization, settling heavier than the wound itself. Whatever truth she carried, it was worth killing for. And now, he was bound to it, whether he wished it or not. The desert spat them out at dawn. By the time Isabella and Jack stumbled into the ruin of the old watch station, the sky was the color of ash, streaked with the pale fire of morning. The place had once been a way station for scouts, a roof of weather-beaten planks, a rusting bell that no longer rang, and walls scarred by bullets older than their memories. It was no home, but it was shelter, and shelter meant survival. Jack lowered himself onto a bench whose wood creaked under his weight. His wound was bound now thanks to her hands, but each movement pulled against it. Isabella busied herself with the space-clearing dust from a corner, her wrists free at last, though the faint ridges of rope still marred her skin. Neither spoke. Words they had both learned were often more dangerous than silence, yet silence itself became a kind of bridge. Isabella leaned against the cold stone wall, her eyes adjusting to the dim. She thought of the life she had left behind, the parlor curtains drawn against gossip, the hollow voice of a husband who spoke to crowds but never to her. In that hollow house, she had become invisible, here bound to a man who might still decide her fate. With a twitch of a finger, she felt more seen than she had in years. Jack's gaze found her in the half-light. He had killed men for less than the hesitation she stirred in him. But watching her now, brushing dust from her palms, lifting her chin, as if defying the ruin around them, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Not desire, not yet. Something slower, heavier, more dangerous. Recognition, maybe. The wind pushed through the gaps in the boards, carrying the scent of dust and mesquite. Isabella closed her eyes. For a moment, she could almost believe the war had not happened, that the desert was not trying to bury them both. The rhythm of Jack's breathing filled the silence, steady though laced with pain. Human. Mortal. When she opened her eyes again, he was watching her. She held his gaze unflinching. "You don't talk much," she said softly, the words almost lost in the wind. "Talking wastes strength," he answered, his voice gravel low. "And yet, you keep me alive." She returned, her tone neither gratitude nor accusation, simply fact. Jack looked away, jaw tight. Because you kept her alive, he thought. The memory of his mother, pale and gasping, and the steady hands that refused to let death claim her. He wanted to tell Isabella, to lay that debt between them, like an offering. But the words would not come. Instead, he rose slowly, grimacing at the pull of his wound, and walked to the doorway. Outside, the desert stretched endless, a sea of silence. He thought of the silver he was promised for her death, and for the first time the weight of that silver felt like chains. Behind him, Isabella sat with her back straight against the wall. In the quiet ruin, she felt something stir inside her, not trust, not yet, but the faintest ember of hope. Perhaps it was only the cruelty of circumstance forcing two souls together in the wreckage of what had been. Or perhaps it was something rarer, something the desert itself could not swallow. The station was broken, but it stood. And in its shadow, so did they. The night came with no moon, only the restless whisper of the wind sliding through the bones of the abandoned station. Isabella sat upright against the wall, her ears straining at every creak of timber, every sigh of sand against stone. Jack had dozed lightly by the doorway, revolver in his lap, but his eyes snapped open the same moment she stiffened. Footsteps, or the echo of them. Close. Too close. Her breath caught. The silence that followed was heavier than sound so dense, it felt like a mud pressing against her throat. Jack moved to the wall, his body tense, listening. The ruin around them seemed to breathe, boards shifting, the old bell swaying slightly on its rusted chain. Isabella's pulse raced. For a heartbeat, she believed this was the end. Another hired hand had tracked them, and death was at the threshold. Jack's shadow loomed near her in the darkness. He crouched close enough that she could smell the dust and sweat on his skin. Their eyes met in the half-light, gray into brown, two strangers tangled by chance and chains. "If it's tonight," she whispered, voice steady, though her chest burned, "then let us face it without lies." He didn't answer. The silence stretched taut as wire. Then, like a spark struck from stone, something passed between them. A recognition, not of past deeds or debts, but of the bare fact that in this moment, alive and trembling, they were more than fugitives, more than contracts. They were human. Jack's hand brushed her cheek, rough from years of dust and gunmetal. And before either could think, their mouths met. The kiss was not hunger, not fire. It was survival, an anchor thrown against the tide of fear. A desperate, wordless vow: we are still here. We are still worth saving. When he drew back, the night was no less dangerous, but her heart beat with a defiance she had not felt in years. Both of us, Isabella murmured, her lips trembling, are worth more than this. Jack's gaze held hers, steady, searching. And then, as though the kiss had loosed some long-buried truth inside him, he spoke. I know who you are, he said quietly. Not just Holden's wife, not just a nurse. Isabella frowned, confusion clouding her eyes. You were there, he went on, voice rough, breaking on the memory. Field hospital. My mother, she was dying, fever, lungs filled with smoke. Everyone had given up, everyone but you. You held her down, stitched her, cooled her, and you told me she would live. She did. Because of you. Her lips parted in shock. The memory she had buried beneath countless others, the endless rows of cots, the fevered faces, the endless blood blurred at the edges. How could she remember one woman among hundreds? Yet in his voice, there was no doubt. Isabella shook her head slowly. I don't. You wouldn't remember, Jack. Cut in a bitter edge to his tone. You saved too many. To you it was duty. To me it was everything. The weight of his words fell between them like a stone. For the first time since their paths had crossed, Isabella could not summon silence as armor. Her chest tightened. All this time she had thought herself powerless, a pawn bound for execution. But now this revelation shifted the ground beneath her feet. Jack's gaze hardened, as though freeing himself. So understand this. I can't kill you. Not now. Maybe not ever. Her breath caught. The man she had seen as her executioner had just spoken the words that unshackled her flight. The rope marks still etched her wrists, but they no longer bound her. For Jack, the admission tasted of iron, part relief, part damnation. He had broken the unspoken rule of his trade, to never let the target become more than a shadow. But Isabella Marlowe was no shadow. She was the woman who had saved his mother, the one who had kissed him in the face of death, the proof that he was still capable of faith. The ruin around them seemed to exhale. Outside, the desert kept its secrets. But inside, something irrevocable had shifted. The hired gun could no longer be her executioner, and Isabella, for the first time, no longer felt like prey. Dawn broke pale and unforgiving, washing the desert in silver that revealed every scar, every hollow bone of the land. Isabella stood at the threshold of the ruined watch station, the wind pulling her hair loose as she stared east toward prosperity, toward the town she had fled, and the man who had once called her wife. Behind her, Jack adjusted the bandage at his side. The wound still bled when strained, but he moved with the stubbornness of a man who had learned to walk through pain. His revolver hung heavy at his hip. He watched her, saying nothing, waiting for her to speak what both of them already knew. At last she turned. Her eyes were steady, almost calm. We go back. Jack's brow furrowed. Back to the town. To Holden. Her voice carried the weight of a verdict. If I keep running, they'll never stop hunting. If I stand, if I show them what he is, they'll have no choice but to listen. Jack studied her jaw, teeth tight. He could have argued, could have reminded her that townspeople did not side with fallen women, that silver tongues bought silence faster than bullets. But he saw in her eyes the same fire that had once told a terrified boy his mother would live. It was not recklessness. It was resolve. The man who hired me, he said slowly, was Holden. She did not flinch, though the name pressed like a knife against old scars. I guessed as much, she replied softly. But Jack shook his head. You don't understand. He didn't just want you gone for shame or spite. He paid dearly, more than any woman's silence is worth. He hesitated, then added, he knew you had the papers. At that, Isabella's breath caught. The image burned in her mind, a locked box, hidden beneath floorboards, the brittle documents. she had stolen before leaving. Records of men declared dead on paper, so their land could be seized while the mayor's pockets swelled with gold. Maps signed with military seals, proof of betrayal and profiteering. Her fingers curled against her skirts. Then he fears me still. Jack's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. He fears the truth you carry. Enough to kill for it. Enough to pay me and another, and maybe more besides. For a moment, the ruined station seemed smaller, the walls pressing close with the weight of revelation. Isabella drew a breath and let it out slowly. Then the truth is the only weapon I have left. Silence stretched, broken only by the dry rattle of the wind. Jack turned his eyes east toward Prosperity, the town that had shaped and shackled them both in different ways. He thought of the silver promise, the easy road of walking away. But there was no walking away now. Finally he said, "Then we ride back. But know this, when you stand against Holden, you stand against the town he owns. They won't thank you for it." Isabella's lips curved, not in bitterness, but in something colder. "I don't want their thanks. I want their eyes open." Jack nodded once. The decision was made, though it might carry both of them to ruin. He tightened the belt around his waist, wincing at the pull of the wound, then reached for the reins. The horses stamped restlessly, sensing the shift in their riders. Isabella climbed into the saddle, with the grace of someone who had long ago learned to endure discomfort. Jack mounted beside her. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the sand, they rode east, back toward the town, back toward Holden Marlowe, and back into the lion's den. The desert did not hold them anymore. The battle ahead would not be with sand and silence, but with men, lies, and the voice of a husband who had once sworn to protect her. Now she would expose him as instead. She should have vanished, another casualty left, to sand and silence. Instead she returned with the very thing he feared, proof. So he set the trap. 3 men he trusted with blood, more than with coin. 2 killers from out of town. And one who once shared whiskey and bullets with Jack Callahan, beneath the black banners of war. The ambush came on the road outside Prosperity, where the rocks funneled travelers like cattle through a chute. Jack sensed it a moment too late, the hush in the wind, the twitch of the horses, the echo of boots on stone. Gunfire split the morning. The first bullet grazed Jack's shoulder, spinning him half out of the saddle. He fired back, the crack of his Colt echoing off canyon walls. Isabella ducked low, clutching the saddle horn, her heart hammering, as dust and smoke exploded around her. Then came the voice, a shout over the cow's familiar, bitter. "Callahan, you ride with ghosts now." Jack's stomach clenched. He knew that voice. Harris. Once a brother in arms, now another hound bought with Holden's silver. "Don't do this, Harris," Jack roared, his words half choked with blood. But loyalty to the past could not outbid the price of betrayal. The gunfight raged. Horses screamed, steel rang against stone, the air thick with powder. Jack dropped one man with a clean shot, but Harris's bullet tore across his ribs, driving him to his knees. Another blast sent his revolver skittering across the dirt. Isabella's scream died in her throat. She saw him fall, saw the blood soaking his shirt, and in that instant, the years of silence, of being caged and erased, broke inside her. She seized Jack's Colt with trembling hands. Holden stood at the far end of the canyon, smug, certain of victory, his tailored coat dusted, but his smile untouched. He raised a pistol toward her, his voice carrying, smooth and oily as ever. "You should have stayed buried, Bella." Her hand shook. The gun was heavy, too heavy, but she lifted it, pointed it at the man who had stolen her name, her life, her years. For a breathless instant, the world narrowed to his face. One twitch of her finger, and the past would end in smoke. But she stopped. Killing him would bury the truth along with his body. And she had not fought this far, for vengeance alone. She lowered the gun, lips trembling, voice ragged with defiance. "No, You don't get to vanish that easy." Holden sneered, but his smirk faltered when Isabella pulled a bundle of worn papers from her satchel, raising them high. By noon, the marketplace of prosperity was packed. Holden's voice boomed over the crowd, polished and commanding as always. "Lies," he declared, gesturing to Isabella with theatrical disdain. "The bitterness of a discarded wife. She weaves fables to wound me." The townsfolk shifted uneasily. Some spat in the dust, others muttered. Truth and lies were difficult to tell when silver oiled the scales. Isabella stood on the wooden steps of the courthouse, her hands trembling around the brittle papers. She had never addressed a crowd before. Her life had been spent in parlors and sick rooms, in shadow behind a man's voice. Her throat burned, fear clawing at her ribs. But then she remembered the kiss in the ruin, the warmth of Jack's blood on her hands, the memory of a boy whispering, "Save her." She drew a breath and forced her voice through the tremor. "This," she lifted the papers, "isn't rumor. It's record. The names of men declared dead so their land could be stolen. The maps Holden signed. The blood he sold while you bled for nothing." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. Stronger now, carrying above the murmurs. "I was silent for too long. He made me believe I was nothing but his shadow. But today I speak, and you will hear me." The crowd hushed. Even the children at the edges stilled. Holden's protests rang thin against her words. For the first time in years, Isabella's voice filled the square, not as an echo of a man's, but her own. And it cut deeper than any bullet she could have fired. The morning after the square erupted with truth, Holden Marlowe was led through the streets of prosperity in irons. The man who once commanded every corner with his voice now kept his eyes low, jaw clenched against humiliation. 2 deputies escorted him, their rifles ready, bound for the long road to Fort Smith, and a trial that promised more witnesses than allies. Isabella watched from the steps of the courthouse. She felt no triumph, only the weight of smoke after fire. The air carried whispers, some sharp with praise, others edged with suspicion. "She's braver than any of us," one woman murmured, clutching her child's hand. "A fine speech," muttered a rancher, his eyes narrow. "But who's to say she isn't cut from the same cloth as him? They shared a roof long enough." The words pierced, though Isabella kept her face still. She had known all along that exposing Holden would not make her a saint in their eyes. Truth was heavy, and those who carried it were seldom thanked. Beside her, Jack shifted on his wounded side, silent as ever. He scanned the crowd, hand near his revolver, though no threat stirred. Yet his gaze lingered on her, not protective, not possessive, but steady, like a tether to keep her from drifting too far into doubt. When the wagon bearing Holden rattled out of town, the square slowly emptied. Prosperity returned to its business, its gossip, its uneasy balance. Isabella turned away at last, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We don't belong here," she said quietly. Jack gave a single nod. Never did. That evening, they rode beyond the edge of town, past the last lanterns, into the long stretch where the desert swallowed roads. They did not stop until the broken silhouette of the old military outpost rose against the sky. Once the place had been a field hospital. Isabella remembered its corridors filled with groans, with prayers whispered into the dark. Now it was abandoned, its timbers weathered but still standing. "This will do," Jack said simply, sliding from his horse with a wince. Within days they gave the ruin new shape. Jack repaired the leaning walls of the stable, hammer echoing into the hills until it could hold more than horses, it could hold them. Isabella scrubbed the dust from a wide room, her fingers raw, and gathered scrap benches to line against the walls. Soon children came. Orphans, half wild, drawn first by curiosity, then by hunger, then by the promise of words written on slate. Isabella knelt beside each of them, chalk in hand, her voice steady, as she traced letters, coaxing them to follow. To see their eyes widen at the shape of language was a gift she had not expected. Jack watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame. His hands bore new scars from labor, his shoulders broader from work not measured in kills, but in beams and nails. At night, he collapsed into the straw-scented dark, with a weariness that did not taste of guilt. The desert had not grown softer. It never would. But within those walls, half ruin, half rebirth, something had taken root. Smoke lingered from the fires of their past, yes. But seed too had been sown. And Isabella Marlowe, once silenced, now spoke each day with children who listened. Jack Callahan, once a blade for hire, now built a home with his own hands. The world outside might still doubt them, but here in this fragile Eden of dust and timber, they had begun again. The weeks slid into months measured not by gunfire, but by the quiet rhythms of work. The sound of hammers instead of pistols, children's laughter instead of men's curses. Yet the desert-like memory never truly released its hold. One evening, Isabella sat at the rough-hewn table Jack had built from scavenged timber. In her palm lay a small wooden box, worn smooth at the edges. She opened it slowly, as though unlocking something iron. Inside, cushioned by a strip of cloth, rested a single bullet, its casing tarnished, its tip misshapen from the impact that had nearly stolen Jack's life. She turned it in her fingers, the weight both slight and immeasurable. To most, it was scrap metal. To her, it was the line between absence and presence, between silence and the sound of his breath, beside her at night. With a length of wire, she had threaded it onto a ring, and now it hung from her hand like a talisman. A key not to a house, but to a life she had almost lost before it began. Jack entered quietly, wiping dust from his hands, his shirt dark with sweat from the day's labor. He paused at the sight of the box. "You keep that?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and something softer. Isabella closed the lid and smiled faintly. "I keep it because it reminds me that you stayed, that we stayed." He nodded once, as if he could not argue with that kind of truth. The next morning, Jack worked at the gate he had raised from split logs, the entrance to what was slowly becoming a home. He carved with a steady hand, the knife biting into the wood, each stroke deliberate. Isabella watched from the doorway, shading her eyes against the sun. When he stepped back, the words gleamed raw against the grain, "Kiss me first if you're going to kill me." The phrase that had bound them from the start, once desperate, now defiant, now reborn, as something else entirely. Not a plea, not a bargain, but a memory, carved into permanence. Travelers who passed along the dusty trail often paused to read the strange inscription. Some chuckled, shaking their heads at the mystery of it. Others frowned, muttering that frontier folk grew stranger with every mile west. But those who had known loss, who had stared death in the eye and come back scarred but breathing, they understood. A smile would flicker at the corner of their lips, a nod of recognition, as if they too carried an unspoken story. The desert still burned and withered, still claimed the unwary. It remained merciless. Yet here on the edge of its reach stood a gate, with words that turned cruelty into vow, fear into promise. Isabella touched the bullet-turned keychain at her belt. Jack rested his hand on the carving, the wood rough beneath his calloused fingers. In the heart of the wasteland where most believed nothing could grow,